Hello everybody and welcome back to a lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue right on with our discussion regarding the movements, the counterculture revolution movements of the 1960s and early 1970s. We last left off in our lecture. We were discussing abortion and the early abortion laws, particularly the groundbreaking case of Roe v. Wade in 1973 that granted legal protection to early term abortions. We also looked at the late 19th century movement to sort of put abortion laws on the books, and the fact that this late 19th century movement or push was largely overseen or orchestrated by Protestant groups who had before then been kind of lukewarm, had a sort of lukewarm reaction to had a kind of lukewarm reaction to abortion, and now that at least in the late 19th century, has the Catholic population was rising, and as the Catholic birth rate continued to rise, they began to fear that the Protestant the Protestant population will be outstripped and turned into a minority. So they began to push for anti-abortion laws to sort of prop up and sort of increase the Protestant birth rate, and to stave off a quote-unquote Catholic takeover. And we also looked at the irony that 75 years later, in the 1960s, it would be the Roman Catholics who championed anti-abortion laws, that were put on the books to disenfranchise, to discriminate against Roman Catholics. From there, we pick up our narrative, and we'll examine the case of Sherry Finkbein, and it's a very interesting case, and it arises in 1962. Finkbein was a mother of four from Arizona, whose husband had brought back for her a sleeping pill called thalidomide. Now, thalidomide was linked to severe birth defects amongst European women. And when she realized that she was with child, and that the child could have possibly severe birth defects, she spoke with her doctor, and her doctor counseled her to receive an abortion, what was then called a therapeutic abortion. She later told one of her friends about the entire situation. And the entire thing developed a life of its own. The friend worked for a newspaper and got the entire story published in a local newspaper. And to her horror, Finkbein found out that she was that she had become a public pariah, and that there was a great public outcry about her decision. Her detractors admonished her with the rhetoric that the child was not hers to dispose of, and that what she had done was tantamount to infanticide. She was one of the first cases This was one of the first cases. The Finkbein case was one of the first that led to abortion entering the arena of public debate. Radical feminists in the 1970s launched the campaign for reproductive freedom, the absolute right to decide such issues for themselves rather than have a doctor instruct them. They taught this principle that abortion was a right, which, in addition to being a radical new concept, is also an extremely controversial idea. They were delighted by the breadth of the Roe v. Wade decision, just as opponents of abortion law were horrified by it. Opponents to abortion law, pro-abortion law, were horrified by it. Now, in 1969, the gay liberation movement began as well, and it also made analogous claims to the legitimacy of the civil rights movement and the and also to the legitimacy of the feminist movement. Um, in that homosexuals began to identify as a minority group. They cited the discrimination they received in employment, social conduct. They were in the 1960s a despised group, a very despised group at large. They argued that they should have the same legal protections as other Americans. The incident that sparked the organization and the protests was the Stonewall riot of 1969. Now, the riot involved the patrons of a gay bar in New York City, who, instead of fleeing when the police arrived to raid the establishment, stayed and fought off the police. Now, this act of assertion for the American gay community became as important to the act of asserting the ideology of nonviolence had been for the leaders of the integrationist groups of the civil rights movement, or you could say has important had the eye for an eye ideology that the separatist groups employed. Also, the separatist civil rights groups employed. Now, from then on, from 1969 on, the issue of coming out became a central issue for homosexuals. That is, should you declare publicly that you are a homosexual, or is it ethical for you to out someone that is still closeted? Those two questions remain controversial right up to the contemporary era. Until 1973, the American psychiatrists, the American psychiatry industry, this whole industry, regarded homosexuality as a mental illness. But by the end of the 20th century, a great reversal had taken place, with homophobia being regarded as an affliction. An astounding shift to say that homosexuality is no longer a mental illness, but homophobia, the fear of homosexuals, is an affliction. Is the true disorder. In the early 1980s, the identification of AIDS intensified the public policy debates, particularly those around intravenous drug use, homosexuality, and of course premarital relations. With groups opposed to drug use, to gays, and to premarital sex, arguing that in the old days, in the old order, we didn't have any of the problems. It's only with these events after the counterculture revolution that we have these anomalies afflicting our society. Now, those groups felt these very rapid changes in society, and it led to a very sharp anti-feminist, anti-gay. Have you seen there was an anti-civil rights? All of these, all of the counter revolution platforms or groups or movement, they all received very strong backlashes from conservative Americans. Now, the great figure in the women's movement or the feminist movement, the great counter figure to the feminist movement, was Phyllis Schlafly. Now, Schlafly was the leader of an organization called Stop ERA. Her life was full of paradoxes. When she was a young woman, she paid her way through college by test firing machine guns in a machine gun factory during World War II. She was a mother of 6, the wife of a lawyer, and she was very well educated. She was articulate and accomplished in her own right. She was a lobbyist who, more than anyone else, fit the profile of the woman who could do it all. She was a real-life Rosie the Riveter. She was the archetype of the feminist career woman. Now, Mrs. Schlafly herself was completely unenthused about the feminist movement. She was angered that the feminists would want to alter society. She wanted to stop it. She wanted to nip it in the bud completely. Now, the Equal Rights Amendment passed in 1972 and seemed destined to become a part of the federal Constitution. An amendment needs to be ratified by 2/3 of the states, which currently we have 50 states, so that means that 38 states need to ratify an amendment for it to become federal law, or part of the federal Constitution. Very quickly, the amendment was approved by 35 state legislators. 35 state legislatures approved it. To forestall the amendment from gathering the remaining 3 votes, Schlafly created and organized a very powerful grassroots organization, usually primarily composed of stay-at-home mothers. Schlafly argued that women in the United States were going to be treated the same as women in the Soviet Union. That is, they were going to go into combat like the Russian women did during World War II. There were going to be unisex bathrooms like there were in the Soviet Union, and that this amendment would be enforced by the federal government, which would grossly expand federal power at the expense of state and local level officials. Schlafly was able to forestall ratification of the amendment, and it has never been added to the Constitution. Even now, the ERA was never ratified. There's some controversy regarding whether it's still eligible, whether it had to be reintroduced to Congress yet again, and whether it would have to be voted upon by each state legislature again. Schlafly was able to forestall ratification of the amendment. She was able to even convince legislatures that had previously already ratified it as soon as it come out, to go back and quote unquote de-ratify the amendment, and that sparked another intense debate regarding whether a state could indeed withdraw their support for an amendment, whether they could de-ratify an amendment. Many arguing that you can't. It would really just